Ecclesiastes chapter 10. As we navigate life here, as Solomon says, under the sun, I believe there may be times of temptation when we think maybe we can indulge in just a little wrong. We can play around with just a little worldliness, a little error, a little folly. It is tempting sometimes for people to say to themselves, it couldn't hurt just a little. Not wholesale indulgence in wickedness, but in certain situations we may reason that just a little wrong could be overlooked. That kind of thinking is directly addressed and answered in the opening verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Listen to verses 1 through 4. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So, a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. In the time of Solomon and the other kings of Israel, in that time and culture, perfume and various ointments were common, and in some locations became something like commodities. In manufacturing a perfume, similar to a pharmaceutical lab, great care was taken to avoid even small amounts of contamination. It was like a medicine compounding process. They didn't have the kind of high-tech labs that are common today, but within the methods they had, they were as cautious as they could be to avoid contamination. The ingredients in perfume hold a precise and delicate balance that cannot be compromised. One dead fly in the ointment and the sweet fragrance becomes a stench. What's his point? So, a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. It only takes a little. So some of the key words we're going to encounter in Ecclesiastes 10, caution, urgency. Take this seriously. A little folly outweighs wisdom. We need to reject any thought that little compromises are okay. A little white lie, just a few drinks, a little intoxication, just a little internet pornography, a little false teaching, just a small amount of animosity or prejudice, resentment or wrath, just a few bad companions, just an occasional night without moral restraint. Solomon says no. Christians must strive to be diligent about every aspect of our obedient response to God. Just a little cannot be allowed or justified. Our determination of heart ought to be the greatest kind of care about every area of life under the sun before God. One more thing, it takes far less effort to ruin something than it does to create it. A visibly successful and lucrative career can be ruined by 5 minutes of indiscretion. An apparently great marriage that may have lasted over many years can be brought into crisis by one evening of adultery. One person who is out of sorts with God can discourage and contaminate a church of hundreds of members. Ecclesiastes 9:18. Remember that? One sinner destroys much good. So beware of the fly in the ointment. Verse 2. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Now, here's what we must do with this immediately. We must avoid a distraction. This has nothing to do with modern American political philosophy. The right-left political spectrum that we are familiar with had no existence, no reality in the time of Solomon. Israelites didn't discuss politics like Americans. Israelites didn't vote. It was nothing like our political atmosphere, where groups and philosophies are identified in terms of right and left. So we need to dismiss any idea that this statement written by Solomon back before Christ conforms to some modern political positioning. This is simply about the wide difference between the wise man and the foolish man. Wisdom and folly are poles apart, moving in opposite directions. That's all we can make of this. Solomon simply wants us to know how different wisdom is from folly. The big gap, the distance between the two, poles apart. The wise man is moving in one direction, while the foolish man moves in the other direction. It is really interesting to me how the Bible identifies the fool. Let's talk for a minute about the fool in the biblical sense. Folly does not always show up on the low end of an IQ scale. For instance, it is the fool who says in Psalm 14 verse 1, "There is no God." The writer of Ecclesiastes has already identified the fool. Lazy, ill-tempered, morally blind, refuses to take advice. His life is not in line with God's direction. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Very different. That's in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, right here on the page before us. Let's go further. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. To those who are perceptive, alert, and wise, who the fools are is clear. To those with some perception and wisdom, even to some who are not wise, who the fools are is obvious. Fools don't need to wear name tags. Do you know people who just don't have good direction in life? Who seem to stumble through life and fall down often? Who just occupy selfishness and confusion and destruction? Who the fools are is exceedingly clear to those who have their minds trained by divine wisdom, even by some who may have no relationship with God. The fool, by his behavior, tells everybody he or she is a fool. They just don't need name tags. It says next, "If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest." Here is an essential function of God's Word working in us, and it is simple: composure. We've mentioned caution. Now we can add to that this word composure, working in our character consistently. We have noted this on many occasions through Ecclesiastes, and we see it also in Proverbs: self-control, self-discipline. Sometimes it could be called composure, lack of rebellious impulse. If someone in power has something against you, don't just immediately fight back out of some foolish defense impulse that isn't thought out. We need to know that calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Don't just walk out or get mad in circumstances like this. Maintain some composure, calmness. It will lay great offenses to rest. It is like Solomon is saying: calm down, breathe, keep the flies out of the ointment, don't quit, keep going. Great wisdom for living under the sun. Next, I'll be reading verses 5 through 7. "There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich set in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. What's that all about? One main idea: what we expect is not what we always see. Sometimes foolish people rise to very high places. Sometimes the rich sit in a low place. Solomon saw slaves on horses while princes were walking. I think this is one of those places where Solomon isn't telling us to do anything. He is simply describing life under the sun. Not everything happens as we would expect it to happen. There are anomalies and enigmas all around us here on earth. We need to be aware of that as we navigate life under the sun. Verses 8 through 10. Ecclesiastes chapter 10. I'm going to read now verses 8 through 10. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. So Solomon describes several situations in which a great amount of caution is needed. Caution continues to be one of the highlights of this section of Ecclesiastes. These are physical illustrations with spiritual and moral lessons. The man who digs a pit faces many dangers. He needs to be very careful. From time to time we hear about this sort of thing in the news. A ditch or a trench was being put in and a worker was trapped when the dirt caved in. This is an illustration of a task which requires caution. The man who breaks down a hedge must watch for dangers that lie hidden in or under the hedge, like a snake. Here's another case where you have a physical task that requires caution. Then, the man removing stones might injure himself by picking up too much weight, by causing a rock slide which might hurt him. The man chopping wood must be careful not to hurt himself. Nowadays, when you buy an axe or a chainsaw, there's a sheet of paper giving safety instructions and guidelines and requiring that you wear protective eyewear. So we have here 4 illustrations from the physical labor of man, and in each case what Solomon emphasizes is caution, safety, think before you act. Solomon saw many in his life who engaged in some job or labor, but without the necessary caution. This says something to all of us about life with regard to morals, spiritual matters, discipleship, and the decisions we make about our lives. Be careful, stop and think. Don't forget the need for caution or spiritual safety. It is so important to do what's right. Take some time to think and pray and prepare. Let me use this statement to help us consider it. Avoid the perils of your own work. Every occupation, every task, every application of energy is accompanied by certain risk or dangers. The wise person takes those risks into account. It is not enough to have energy and some skill. You better have wisdom and caution to go with it. The tree has to fall somewhere. In evacuation, the rocks have to land somewhere. Sharpen your tools. Be careful and don't take unnecessary risk. Now, Solomon is not giving a seminar on workplace safety. This is not an OSHA conference. What is intended here is we take these illustrations from the physical world and we apply them in the spiritual world. Be careful. Apply caution in your religious and moral life, in relationships, in responding to events, in resisting temptation and making choices. Don't be impulsive. Apply thoughtful preparation and be careful. And in verse 11, Solomon says that when we fail to use good judgment about things, we're like an enchanter who tries to handle the snake without first enchanting the animal, or a babbler, somebody who talks and talks without restraint or caution or good thoughts. So this passage warns us against impulse, reckless action, where we jump into something quickly without thought or caution. Can you think of some of the ways this might apply to us? Are there some things we may be tempted to do that could cause great harm? And the problem is, we didn't exercise caution. We didn't think it through. Marriage, career decisions, use of our money, entertainment, work in the local church that we may undertake. The list is endless of things we may be tempted to do without thought, where caution ought to be present. Wisdom helps make life better here under the sun, and all this wisdom and caution and composure needs to be applied prayerfully and diligently by those of us who are Christians. Let's go ahead and take up 12 down through 15. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Verse 12 sets up a contrast, and the contrast is between a wise man's mouth and the lips of a fool. Here, Solomon tells us something we've learned through our own observations. The more fools talk, the more obvious it may be that they are a fool. Have you ever been around somebody who just loves to talk? I mean excessively, without giving you time to respond, without any good places to stop, and perhaps with little mental processing before the tongue is engaged. I'm talking about the person who never listens but only talks. And if they ever stop long enough for you to say anything, it doesn't matter because they don't listen to you anyway. Solomon says there are these fools you will encounter in life, and the more they talk, the more evidence there is they are foolish. Now, I think the point is we need to know this about other people, and we need to guard against this in ourselves. And please remember that the fool in Scripture is not just the clown, the goofy, stupid fella. He may be all of this, but his defining characteristic is he refuses to listen to God and do God's will. This verse paints the fool as one who is not only wrong-headed and dangerous, but obvious. The more he talks, the more he discredits himself and gives evidence of his lack of wisdom. Orson Card said, and Sam Rayburn used to quote this all the time, "Among my most prized possessions are words that I have never spoken." More familiar to Christians would be James 1:19, "Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak." You know, the benefit of silence is something we may not talk about. We may be silent about the benefit of silence. It's easier to listen when you're not talking. You may have more time to process what's being said and frame good thoughts when you are silent and you listen. Others can listen better when we are silent. If we keep our mouths shut, there is zero risk of showing ourselves to be a fool. Verses 16 through 20. We are in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verses 16 through 20, the final section. "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. Solomon returns here to the, camera angle. Solomon returns to the subject of men who govern, some not qualified. And he addresses this through pronouncing a woe, which simply means this is bad. This is not good. Woe to you in verse 16. It is especially tough when a leader of a people is not qualified, immature, distracted by the pursuit of pleasure. Some people who hold power do not use their power for the people or the good of the nation. Did you know that? They use their power for themselves, to become engaged in their own excesses of food and drink and entertainment and financial benefit. The leaders described here do not eat for nourishment so they can be healthy and active in serving the people. They eat to indulge appetite and get drunk. Solomon says the obvious. This is bad. And he gives us this comparison. It's like not taking care of your house. And through laziness and indifference, the roof leaks and everything falls apart. Picture a man sitting in his lazy boy recliner, drinking beer, yelling at his family to shut up, watching the ball game, and the house is falling apart. The roof is about to collapse. The plumbing is in need of repair. He is doing nothing but indulging his appetites. Solomon gives us that picture in verse 18, and the context is rulers and leaders who don't do their job, but rather indulge their appetites. These rulers see bread and drink as the stuff that feeds their appetite rather than nourishment for the body to have energy to serve. But while we ought to recognize this evil, we should be cautious speaking of it, lest we provoke the wrath of the king. So, caution, composure, wisdom, careful what you say. Ecclesiastes reality checks. It takes far less effort to ruin something than it does to create it. Effort and energy is not wrong, but stop and think and pray before impulsively acting. Solomon has given us many of the characteristics of a fool: lazy, ill-tempered, morally blind, refuses to take advice, a life not pleasing to God, and moving in an antithetical direction, an opposite direction from wisdom. Thank you for listening.